welcome back to The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. My name is Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Simon Abrams. Now, Simon is the author of The Northman, A Call to the Gods. And when I was reading the book, I actually sent him a DM. I said, your book is too pretty for me to take notes in, which is not a problem I usually have. It is a nice Insight edition, hardcover, big, coffee table size kind of, lots of great pictures. And again, I couldn't bring myself to mark it up. So thanks to you and your publisher for sending me a copy so we could talk about it. But good to have you on the show, Simon.
Well, thank you for having me for starters. And yeah, the layout of that book, which was designed by editor John Foster and Chris Prince, the latter of whom I worked with on another book for Insight, which was a book about Guillermo del Toro's The Devil's Backbone. And they're exceptional in terms of laying it out and designing that stuff. But all due credit as well should go to some of the amazing people whose material we were able to feature in that, like the costume designs of Linda Muir and production designer Craig Lathrop, the storyboards, some of which that director Robert Eggers did, some really stunning concept art, set photos, and it's the kind of stuff that like really helps to paint a very vivid picture of how exceptional it is to see the movie has so much of that stuff in it. Because, reading the script initially, I was approached by Chris, my editor for the Del Toro book, to do the project since I'd done that book before and I knew how to do this type of book. And he asked me what I thought, and I read the script, and we get to a very key scene at the end. And if you've seen the movie, I'm sure you can guess what it is. And but like I'm reading this script and I'm just like, they didn't actually film that, did they? They didn't actually do that. And then I watched the movie and I was like, there it is. There's the scene. And it's like, it's amazing to see just how much of this, like, really, I don't know how to describe it. Just this kind of engrossing and very singular movie is on the screen,
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the actual process of writing it.
Yeah, I had been approached. I'm trying to think what the timeline here is. Basically, they had already finished the film, and at least they mostly finished it. They were still working on edits, and I think they might have even been. I'm trying to think. There were reshoots, and I'm trying to think what the timeline is of that. But I had access to a work in progress of the film, which I watched a couple times during the making of the movie, and it was a fairly complete version of the film. So by the time I was approached, what was interesting is they weren't initially sure whether I could actually see the movie or not. And I think even Anya Taylor-Joy and some of the crew were like, you've seen it before we have. And I was like, ha, how about that? But I had been, I'd gotten to see a fairly polished and professional looking version of the film, which at that point, it was fairly clear that this, the movie was basically what it was by that point,
Yeah. So, I mean, if you haven't seen The Northman, you should. It's. I think it's on Amazon Prime right now. It's on Prime Video. You can watch it there. If you have Prime Video, or you can rent it, or you can go see it at the Museum of the Moving Image. There's going to be a screening of that and Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. We'll talk about that in a second too. But the in between the two showings, there's going to be a signing of the book, so you can pick up a nice copy. The book, Simon will sign it for you. You can give it to your favorite Northman fan for a nice Christmas present. It is again, it's a very handsome looking book, and would make a great gift. But the actual, it's funny. You mentioned it being in kind of final polished shape. One of the things that you talked to the director about, Robert Eggers, he has a a pretty unique style of shooting, right? At least by modern, big blockbuster movie standards. And this isn't it's not a $200 million Transformers movie, but it is a $90 million Viking movie. You don't get a lot of those.
For sure. The approach that he and his regular cinematographer, Jaron Blaschke, use is a very unique kind of single camera approach where rather than going for coverage where you have multiple cameras shooting at once, Jaron is actually shooting all the action in a scene. And the fact that it was a big budget film was part of the challenge, but I think that was also one of the reasons why star producer Alex Skarsgård was wanting something like that, because he recognized in both The Witch, I think it was mostly The Witch that sold him on it, but because he and his fellow producer Lars Knudsen were really they really loved the results that they got with The Witch. I think they knew that singular approach would get interest more than just like results, because like they had been thinking about doing a Viking movie and were wondering like, how come no one's ever done this right, or how come nobody's ever done one that actually feels like it's true to the spirit of this time period or these characters, or like it feels like the real deal basically. And one of Eggers's kind of hallmarks is he does so much research. And I think that that's partly also because like he's always trying to think in terms of like how to get something that like no one else that like feels like unique. And I think that the approach that he does where they film it like that, it was initially, if I'm recalling these early production diaries, I remember seeing that like that approach was not necessarily the most intuitive or the easiest fit with a production of that size. But they got wind of it and they adjusted, and the results are kind of gorgeous. And there's just multiple scenes where like, especially once you know how challenging lighting for one camera is, especially given that like there are a lot of cramped indoor scenes, and fitting some of these cameras into these little like yurt-sized buildings and things. It's fascinating to find out because, like it's single source lighting, it's a giant crane, it's, a tiny room, and there's just so many details in so many of the scenes, interior and exterior. So like it's a real balancing act. And the fact that it was like a big budget action movie, I think just makes even more it really makes it even more unique, because honestly, there really isn't anything comparable to it. Like I know everybody thought of it in terms of like, oh, I know Hamlet, I know Conan the Barbarian, I know these understandable acknowledged influences, but like you just look at the way that they made this, and the harder you look at it, you're just like, what this is like. It's almost like they created like a whole little world just for themselves. And I think one of the things that helped to translate that to the screen was that one camera approach, really, because it created like, you'll just look at any single scene and you'll realize just how few times they cut, or like how few times they like piece together the action through multiple shots, and you just realize that, like there was a lot of care and a lot of just attention to what you're looking at here. And it's very easy to gloss over because it is like a very dense narrative, and you're focused on the dialogue and the way that the characters look and interact with each other. But like, God, it's one of those movies that when you rewatch it, you're just like, wow, that shot lasted a lot longer and has this like really dreamlike effect. And all due credit to Jaron and Robert for getting that, because that's it's something, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, the takes are long without feeling showy, which is I think an important element to kind of creating that realism that draws you in there. I mean, I think we're all used to the big oneer at this point, right? The big, kind of one take. We're gonna do a lot of things. We're gonna move around a lot. And this movie kind of has that. I mean, like the assault on the the berserker assault on the little town is like kind of like that, particularly in the beginning. But it doesn't jump out at you as such, which is nice. The when you were there's one little let me ask for a couple of interesting tidbits that you picked up in your interviews, because half or so of the book is interviews that you conducted with the director, some of the stars, the writer. So what were some of the things that you learned while you were talking to them about the movie?
I learned a lot just in terms of Viking history, because I really wanted to interview a couple of the research experts that they went to. So we have 2 chapters in there where I spoke with Neil Price and Johanna Friedrichsdottir, who were 2 of the 3 main people they went to for Viking history. And because I didn't want to look like an asshole asking them questions like that, I had to do a little reading of my own. I read some of Neil's book, or one of his books about the Vikings, and I kind of did a little reading before speaking with Johanna as well. And in both cases, I just realized that like there are a lot of gaps in the history of the Vikings in terms of like what we have remaining in terms of artifacts, and therefore in terms of a timeline and a clear understanding of what daily life was like. And I think something that very much informs the movie and its blurring of the lines of fantasy and reality is, for them, the spiritual aspects of the story, where whether it's, this kind of like undead mound dweller that he fights to take his sword, or, the witch, or the seer, or the various characters that are fairly supernatural. These elements were part of everyday life, or at least according to some of the recorded Viking sagas. And the sagas vary from historic sagas to like, oh yeah, my uncle was a drunk, and also he might have flown off to Valhalla, or like they have these weird elements that are not terribly consistent. And I think the fact that like you can see a deep respect for the gaps in our historic knowledge in the movie, because the movie is very much, I think, about that. It's very much about like the negotiating process of what is history at this point, and seeing how like a lot of the worries and the concerns that these characters have are very much a product of the fact that like Vikings were basically very much living in a society based on their own might. It was a very unstable society. They were literally living for a while before going to Iceland under a volcano where like the ash could kill you. And it's a very precarious position, because the tribe leader one minute could be just toppled next week by his brother or his brother-in-law, and it was just very much a whoever can hold the position longest gets it. And there's so much detail about that, and about how like that feeds into the anxieties as well as the spiritual questions that they had, that I think is baked into not only the plot here, but in terms of the details. But it's also just a fairly straightforward Hamlet riff. So there's a lot of elements of Conan. There's a lot of elements from other movies that inspired it, like Throne of Blood and Jansko's The Close-Up, Conan the Barbarian, of course, and a few other, The Virgin Spring. But there's also a very culturally specific, I think, concept of, or really question about like what do we know about the Vikings, and how like basically this character who ultimately goes off on this very ambiguous hero's journey, it lets you to read it in several ways, I guess I want to say. So I appreciated that ambiguity, and the more detail I found out about it and where that came from, the more I was just like, God, I didn't even see a quarter of that until I started doing this book, you know?
Yeah, you'll definitely come across a lot of interesting stuff in here. I was fascinated by a lot of the details and all that. Among them, the fact that Alexander Skarsgård, I guess I never really thought about it, but Alexander Skarsgård is basically of this area. He grew up in this region and was his family is from here. And in the I think it's the foreword of the book, he tells an interesting story about his own kind of personal connection to this land.
Yeah, he very much wanted to do justice by something that he had never seen in movies before because of that personal connection you're talking about with, like, how for him it wasn't just a matter of like national pride. It was a matter of like, well, how come I don't see this type of like culture, basically, or this kind of heritage? And like, it wasn't even like a political thing. It was just like, like you watch stuff like, there's even that Vikings TV show, I forget the name, I think it's just called like Vikings, and
Vikings,
yeah. And there's stuff like that where it's just like, it's probably fine for what it is, but it's not what somebody, like, if that's your background, it's not going to do it for you. So I think it was interesting because, like, he very much wanted to do more than that. So
yeah, he great some nice little tidbits. Ethan Hawke also has a preface, and there's a introduction from the director and the screenwriter, whose name I've tried to nail down the pronunciation of, but I'm going to ask you here in live on Squadcast. Is it Sean?
Yeah, that's the closest I've come to.
Okay, yeah, because it's spelled SJON. But it's Sean.
Yeah.
Sean. But it's an Icelandic novelist and screenwriter who worked with Eggers on getting that kind of very Icelandic quality. How did those two hook up, and how did they kind of then hook up with Skarsgård to bring this whole thing together?
I'm thinking it basically weirdly starts with Lars von Trier, because Lars von Trier worked with Sean on Dancer in the Dark. Sean did the libretto, I think they call it, for Dancer in the Dark. And that's how he met Bjork. And he was at a dinner party that Bjork was hosting. And that's where she introduced Sean to Robert Eggers. This was like right after The Witch, I think. And she's like, "Oh, I think you guys would get along really well. Your work complements each other." And she was kind of like a platonic matchmaker in that way. And then after they had some fairly, they hit it off at the party, and they kind of exchanged their respective works. I think he showed him The Witch, and Sean showed him one of his fantasy novels, which have this really eerie, hard to pin down tone, and kind of, they were fascinating for that reason. But like, they immediately were just like, we should do something together, and they didn't really think of it until like Eggers had already spoken to Skarsgård, and I think after that he basically approached Sean about like rewriting and like reworking their script. And Eggers was the primary screenwriter, if I'm understanding it right, but Sean really brought a lot to what Eggers already had,
Yeah, there's a very interesting little tidbit in here that I don't want to overstep here and pick out my favorite scene in the movie. But my favorite scene in the movie is the I don't know, Viking Quidditch, whatever that
the
that
Gnat Licker game. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people who really like that scene as well. It's fantastic, wonderful, kind of very foreign and primordial, yet also familiar
Yes.
and you know, kind of understandable sequence. But that almost didn't make it into the movie, right?
Yeah, it was a very hard film scene to film for starters. There's also no extant sport call, like the choreography for that they entirely had to make up. Nat liquor is not something that is still played. It's mentioned a bunch in the sagas, just in terms of like sometimes there's like a fairly standard scene at like a festive, like a party almost, and like they'll be playing Nat liquor in the background, but like it's not an easy scene to put together, and like finding the location for that scene was really tough because they needed something that they could get a full view of the pitch basically, and finding that, especially in that part of Ireland where they shot, was super tough. And it's kind of amazing. Also, the detail that I always love about that scene is that this isn't probably something that they've struggled with, but I just find it, I can't imagine it being easy casting people who are taller than Alex Skarsgård, and several men in that scene are. It's not just like one or two of them. There's like at least 3 to 5 guys there that are like, oh yeah, you're 6 foot, 2 or 3, or I don't know. I remember, but like there are several that are like, it's like, oh yeah, this guy's like 6'6", this guy's 7'1", this guy's. It's just like, what? How? What did you? And it's like, it's not like camera tricks or anything. It's like they're just big dudes in every way, and it's to me, what especially rewatching, knowing that, I was just like, Jesus Christ, these guys are massive, and the fact that you can't break with that one camera for the choreography, which is just so fast, like it's not an easy scene to do, and I think, I'm trying to remember how many days they took, but it was like that, I think, might have been their most challenging to shoot in terms of single set pieces. It was a tough one.
Yeah, and in the book, Eggers talks several times about how he wanted to take it out because he doesn't like sports. He's not a sports guy. He wasn't super interested, which is a weird. I get it. I mean, I can understand that, but I assume he's also not like a rape and pillage guy. So no. I feel like that's still that's you can still work that in there.
Sure, I think though with the details that he wanted to do, there was stuff that like. Basically, they were trying to negotiate what was essential in terms of the audience expectations, as well as what was authentic to that period. And I think Sean really talked him into it because it was like, this is a normal staple of the Viking saga. And it made sense in that way. Plus, it adds like an extra action set piece. So I think it made sense, and I think honestly his dislike of sports aside, I think he knew that,
Yeah. This is one of the first movies that got shot during the pandemic, during the certainly one of the first big movies, first big productions with lots of people, moving sets and that sort of thing. What was it? What did the director Robert Eggers and the rest of the crew kind of make of that whole situation, aside from just making the best of it and getting it all done?
It was tough because I know they had, before they even started, they wanted to do it in Iceland, a lot more of the principal photography in Iceland, and I think because it was something like a 5-month break, there were some, as you said, incidental benefits. Like production designer Craig Lathrop was building like a house where the roof itself had to have like spores or turf put into it, and it wasn't going to be ready in time for a normal shoot start time. But 5 months later, they returned to the set, and it sprouted. It was completely covered in this turf because, Ireland with rain, and, from something like from March to September or so, or October, something like that. And it was basically, in that time, you had, the grass grew on that roof. And this, likewise, I think what's interesting is that, like, Eggers had to, for example, like, he had to use that time productively, so he was, like, fleshing out even more his storyboards. And what was incredible to me is that, like, they were otherwise able to, like, keep everybody together. Like, there was no question about, like, oh yeah, well, this guy's got to move on, or that guy has to. And it's kind of remarkable to me for that reason, partly because it's just they were able to adapt so well. And I think in some ways the shift to Ireland, the fairly early on shift to Ireland, was a good example of how, like, their adaptability was at least partly dependent on finding the right people to do that. Like, Naomi Liston, the location manager who we interviewed, she had worked on, and I think she is still working on, Game of Thrones for House of Dragon. And I loved her. I wish we had more of her in the book because I love her interview so much. And she is such a character, and she's so funny. And she just talked about how, like, oh, I know Ireland very well. I know exactly where to shoot for this, for that. I know where you want for this view. And it's like, she's just a great example of how, like, you use the change, basically, and they lean into that. I know that, like, Linda Muir and her team, and, they all basically had to use that time. And in some ways it was, I guess, in that sense, not to be Pollyannish about it, but it was kind of a mixed blessing, or a blessing in disguise even.
Yeah. I mean, it was a tough time. I know several shoots that were going on there, and everyone was just going crazy. It was a crazy time. Let's talk a little bit about the screening on Sunday. So I don't know anything about Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. Not familiar with it. Why is this a movie that you wanted to pair with the Northman, and why was Eggers so excited that you got a 35 millimeter print, right?
We did, and well, I had written originally for the book a couple of sidebars that we wound up cutting for space. I mean, the margins for this were so tight that we had to narrow down a lot of the interviews. But I'd done a sidebar of about, I think, 9 films that inspired Eggers, and that he used as reference points to different people like the costume designer or Jaron or others. And what was interesting about that is, when we cut that, I was like, I want to do something with that, though, because I watched, or in some cases rewatched, like Throne of Blood or Virgin Spring, like these movies, and I was just like, some of the ones that aren't already known deserve to be seen, and this seems like a great opportunity. And while I would never knock the idea of showing, like, Conan the Barbarian, because that's a fun movie, or like some of the other stuff that, like, I think in Los Angeles at the American Cinematheque, they had a very nice retrospective for the Northman, which was really cool. But it's like, I wanted to show something that was a little off the beaten track. Stuff like The Fall of Otrar, which is like a Genghis Khan movie, or the 2013 Hard to Be a God, which is just, it's such a stunner. It's such a beautiful film. And I love the reason that we wouldn't show that was because the Museum of the Moving Image had showed it too recently. We had originally talked about showing Conan, and I would have been absolutely fine with it. Conan's, good choice. But Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors is not only something that, like, I feel like is a unique film to see, it's just a gorgeous film. It's a Ukrainian, based on a Ukrainian folktale set in the Carpathian Mountains, and it's kind of like a folktale romance about a doomed romance that, like, it's also involving, like, a sort of vampire-like character, as you might imagine, based on the location, the Carpathian Mountains. And it's by the great director Sergei Parajanov. I'm butchering the name. I'm sorry in advance to Daniel Bird if he listens to it, who has done a lot of work with Parajanov's films. But he's a very interesting filmmaker who's probably best known now for The Color of Pomegranates, which I think the Criterion Collection has. And this is, I think, his first or second feature, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And, it's not an easy film to see. And I was just so stoked to show it because the parallels between the two films are really striking. It's not like a very one-to-one literal series of parallels, but like the romance between these two characters, the sense of like being bound to cultural responsibilities, and the way that romance and one's understanding of not only family but like your role in that society works. I think they're very sympathetic, and they have a lot of interesting parallels. And I think of the movies that I watched for that sidebar, I was especially delighted because I had wanted to see Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors for a while now, but like I just never got around to it. And just finally watching it, I was just like, holy shit, this is amazing. This is just like a stunning movie that like has such like The Northman, has such depth to it, and it's such a beautiful, resonant movie that like is not only just gorgeous to look at, like it seems like the kind of movie that each time you were to watch it, like it would become a different movie or a deeper movie even. And I feel the same way about The Northman. So like seeing them together is going to be such a treat because like like you said, The Northman is already on streaming, and maybe people have already seen it in theaters. But like I feel like for an event like this, I obviously want to give people extra value for their dollar, but like I just wanted to get them something that like is gonna make this, like with the book, like something that's like gonna make them see even more into the film. And I think this is a great choice for that.
Yeah. So that screening again, it's Sunday, November 20th, 2:30 is when I think that's when the Northman screening is, and then the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors after that. You can buy the book, get it signed in between. You should do that. Make sure to pick up a copy of the book. And Museum of the Moving Image, that's in Queens, right?
Yes, Astoria, Queens.
Okay, so it's if you're in the New York metropolitan area, go check it out, or fly there. I mean, I don't know. You can take a bus, train, whatever. Go check out the screening and signing. I always like to close these interviews by asking if there's anything I should have asked. If you think there's anything folks should know, either about your book, the making of your book, the movie itself. What did I fail to ask in this half-hour discussion?
Oh no, that was good. I mean, I would just mention, as an added incentive to pick up the book, we have a preface by Ethan Hawke, and it really is something that, like, even if I weren't involved, if I were to just pick this book up, and this has, it's not me doing it, but like just the layout and the design of it is just something that I'm really happy and proud to be associated with, because the folks at Insight, John and Chris, like they do damn good work at that. And just seeing it all in conversation with the text, especially, and with the interview material, it's very exciting, because it's one thing to describe some of this stuff, and it's another to not only have like images from the movie, but images from like what the movie, the storyboards and the concept art was, and having that all in one place and being able to pour over it, it's special,
Yeah, it really is a beautiful looking book, and Simon's right. I mean, like the stills are great. Stills, everybody loves stills, and the set photos are great too. Everybody loves set photos, but like there's a lot of design art and that sort of thing in here that you don't necessarily get a chance to see too often. So definitely, if you enjoyed the movie, you should really consider picking it up. It's a fascinating, thorough glimpse into its making. So strong recommendation, and make sure you go check out the screening if you haven't seen it already, or if you have. I've seen it both on my TV and in a theater. I will tell you, it's better in a theater because bigger and the sound is better.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how that works out, but whatever. I'm not the boss of you guys. I am Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark, and I will be back next week with another episode of The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. We'll see you guys then.
It could be information to change your life forever. Or the Something You Should Know podcast could just be something interesting. Ramit Sethi, talking about being rich.
The old definition of rich had a lot to do with how much money you accumulated, but it wasn't about how to spend it. It was more about how to get it. But okay, so once you get it, what do you do with it?
In our culture, everybody tells you how to save, but nobody teaches you how to spend it.
Something You Should Know, wherever you listen.